He's known for pulling out chainsaws on stage, a not-so-subtle symbol of his government plans. The former TV pundit has been compared to ex-U.S. President Donald Trump.
His proposals includes dollarizing the economy, ending currency controls, closing the central bank, and cutting spending sharply. He also favors lax gun controls and tighter rules on abortion.
Porque hoy comienza la reconstrucción de Argentina. Hoy retomamos el camino que hizo grande este país. Hoy volvemos a abrazar las ideas de la libertad, las ideas de Alberdi. El modelo de la decadencia ha llegado a su fin. No hay vuelta atrás. Los resultados de este modelo están a la vista de todos. De ser el país más rico del mundo, hoy somos 130. La mitad de los argentinos son pobres y el 10% es indigente. Basta del modelo empobrecedor de la casta. Hoy volvemos a abrazar el modelo de la libertad para volver a ser una potencia mundial.
Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. As you've just seen, Javier Milei, who's been referred to as the Donald Trump of Argentina, a colourful and controversial character, has now been elected as the next official president. And the Argentine economy is currently in a complete state of disarray. Inflation is running at more than 140%, and interest rates are above 130%, and the peso has completely collapsed. And Javier Milei has won this election promoting a libertarian approach. And libertarianism is based around the concept of liberty and a minimal amount of intervention by the government. So he's proposing that Argentina abandons its home currency and takes the US dollar on wholesale. It scraps the central bank and stops setting all of the interest rates and lets the free market dictate exactly what happens to Argentina. And I think this is going to represent a really fascinating period in Argentina's history, and it'll be really interesting to see exactly what happens. So in today's video, I'll have a look at exactly what's going on with inflation and interest rates. We'll look at where the exchange rate for the peso is, and there are two different exchange rates in Argentina, the official rate and the blue dollar rate, or the black market rate, and that's really the one that matters. We'll then have a look at what's going on with GDP, and then finally today I'll wrap up with my summary. So what I think is likely to happen in Argentina over the course of the next 3 to 6 months, and what's going to happen to its economy. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say thank you so much once again to everybody that sent me a YouTube super thanks or bought me a coffee. Really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And also to share with you the exciting news that I've decided to give away this little guy here, this red balloon dog. So if you're interested in winning that, please check out the video at the end of today's video. This chart shows the movement in the official rate of inflation in Argentina over the last 12 months. And the first thing to note about this chart is that the scale on the right-hand side doesn't start at 0, it actually starts at 80% and goes up to 160%, which gives you a flavour of how serious the problem is currently in Argentina. In November 2022, inflation was running at 92.4%, which is completely off the scale. That was one of the highest rates of inflation in the world at that time. However, as you can see from the shape of this chart, over the last 12 months, inflation has continued to escalate. And in October 2023, the official rate of inflation was just short of 143%, which means that on average, things are almost 1.5 times more expensive today than they were this time last year. And just to put things into perspective, this chart shows the official rate of inflation over the last 10 years. And this shows just how extreme the current situation is. Inflation has been a problem in Argentina for a long period of time, and 10 years ago it was running at around 10%, which would be a disastrously high rate for many countries. And between 2014 and the start of the COVID pandemic, inflation did rise and hit a peak of almost 60% in 2019. It then fell during the COVID pandemic. However, since the start of 2022, inflation has taken off and increased from around 50% to the current level of 143%. And to put the problems in Argentina on a global context, this chart shows the current rates of inflation for the G20, which are the 20 largest economies in the world. And not surprisingly, Argentina has by far the highest rate. The next closest country is Turkey, where the official rate of inflation is currently 61%. And then the next closest country in the G20 is Russia, where inflation is 6.7%. And this chart compares inflation for every country in the world. And you can see that there are currently only 2 countries that have a higher level of inflation. Venezuela's current rate of inflation is 318%, which is actually down on the 395% that it was recording in the previous month. And the country with the second highest rate of inflation is Lebanon, where it's 208%, which interestingly is also down against the previous month. And Argentina is number 3 and is the only other country in the world that has inflation above 100%. And if you cast your eye down the rest of this list, there are countries that are in severe economic crises at the moment, which include economies that have been torn apart by wars, such as Syria, Sudan and Sierra Leone, countries that are facing severe economic sanctions, such as Iran and Cuba, and countries on the verge of economic collapse, such as Turkey, Haiti and Pakistan. And I think when you look at Argentina in this context, it really brings home how serious the problems are. This chart shows the movements in food inflation over the last 12 months and follows the exact trend that we've just talked about for general inflation. However, the levels are actually higher, and the current rate of food inflation in Argentina is running at just under 154%. And the reason I wanted to highlight this is, as you saw at the beginning of the video, Javier Milei has stated that over 50% of the Argentine population are currently living in poverty. And when you're living in poverty, you're spending a very high percentage of your free cash on food. And when food prices are increasing by 154%, it puts immense pressure on your family budget. And if you don't have any savings or any spare cash, as prices go up, all that it means is that you're able to buy less food. And there is currently a real danger of food insecurity in Argentina, where people simply won't have enough money to buy enough food for everybody in their family. And this chart compares Argentina's 154% food inflation with the rest of the G20, and you can see that there are only 2 other countries in double figures: Turkey, where food is increasing in price by 72%, and the United Kingdom, which saw a 10.1% increase in October. Every other country in the G20 has food inflation in single figures. And if we compare the situation in Argentina to the rest of the world, once again, the only 2 countries that have a higher rate of food inflation are Venezuela and Lebanon, where it's running at 318 and 239% respectively. However, as you can see from the rest of this table, there are lots of other countries where food inflation is running at extremely high levels, and in many of these countries there is a severe risk of food insecurity. Now, the traditional way of dealing with high levels of inflation is to increase interest rates. And this chart shows the movement in the official rate of interest in Argentina dating back to the start of 2022. Now, once again, a thing to note here is that the scale on the right-hand side doesn't start at 0, it actually starts at 20% and goes up to 140%. So at the start of 2022, the official rate of inflation in Argentina was sitting at 40%, which means that if you wanted to borrow money in Argentina, it was going to cost you more than 40% interest because banks have to make some profit. The base rate of interest is the starting point, and then they'd add their margin on top of that. Now, 40% is an extremely high rate of interest. That would be officially classified as a loan shark in most countries around the world. However, as you can see, over the course of the last 20 months, there have been various interest rate increases, and the current rate is now 133%, which basically means that nobody in their right mind is borrowing any money in Argentina right now because the amount of interest that you would need to pay back is astronomical. However, as we've just seen, over this period, inflation has actually taken off. The increase in interest rates haven't had the desired effect. It hasn't reduced inflation. In fact, inflation has started accelerating. And if we have a look at how the current interest rates in Argentina compare to the rest of the G20, you can see that they're off the scale. Turkey has the second highest interest rates at 35%, followed by Russia at 15%, Brazil at 12.25%, Mexico 11.25%, and every other country in the G20 has interest rates below 10%. And if we have a look at what's going on in the rest of the world, Argentina now has the accolade of being the country with the highest rate of interest in the whole of the world. It's actually overtaken Zimbabwe because Zimbabwe recently introduced a 20% cut and brought its official rate of interest down from 150% to 130%. The country with the next highest interest rates is Venezuela, where it's just over 56%, followed by Turkey at 35%, Ghana at 30%, and Sudan at 28%. So what does this analysis of interest rates actually tell us? Well, I think it indicates that there is a complete disconnect at the moment in the Argentine economy. Interest rates and inflation are no longer linked. So even though the government has been increasing interest rates rapidly, it hasn't had any impact on inflation. And so maybe Javier Milei, with his libertarian approach, is taking the right sort of tack because the traditional method isn't working. This chart shows the official movement in the exchange rate between the US dollar and the Argentine peso over the last 12 months. This time 12 months ago, one US dollar was officially trading for around 164 pesos. Today, it's trading for almost 354, which obviously represents a significant devaluation in the peso. But the thing to note about this chart is that this official rate is managed by the Argentine Central Bank. It's actually controlling and setting this official exchange rate. It isn't a free market float. This chart shows the black market exchange rate between the US dollar and the Argentine peso. And this is also referred to as the blue dollar rate. And this rate is basically the free market float. This is the level that dollars and pesos are actually exchanging for on the streets of Argentina. And as you can see, if you currently want to buy US dollars using pesos, the exchange rate is $1 US for 950 Argentine pesos, which is almost 3 times higher than the official rate set by the Bank of Argentina. And this exchange rate explains why there is such a high level of dollarization currently in the Argentine economy. If you look at the shape of this chart over the last 12 months, it is almost vertical. People have lost faith in the Argentine peso because it's devaluing so rapidly. Because the country has such high levels of inflation, the exchange rate is plummeting, and therefore everybody feels more comfortable dealing in US dollars than they do in pesos. This chart shows the annual movement in GDP as measured quarterly, dating back to September 2020. And what this shows is that since the second quarter of 2021, there has been a consistent fall in the annual rate of GDP. And over the last 12 months, GDP growth has fallen to 5.7% in September 2022, 1.5% in December 22, 1.4% in March 23, and in June of this year, GDP actually fell into negative territory and reduced by 4.9%. Now, we are currently waiting for the GDP figures for September 2023 to be published. However, when you look at the trend of this graph and also what's going on in Argentina, it's extremely likely that GDP growth will be negative again, and it's highly likely that the fall in GDP will be higher than the figure seen in quarter 2 of 2023. And once those figures are released, Argentina will officially be in recession. As it sits at the moment, it isn't, because you have to have 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth to be officially in recession, but it looks like it's simply a matter of time before Argentina is declared to be in recession, and therefore when Javier Milei officially takes over as president, he's likely to be in charge of one of the biggest economies in the world that is currently in recession. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video obviously to let you know that the presidential election has now been decided in Argentina, and the most controversial character, Javier Milei, has been elected as president. Now, as I mentioned at the start of the video, he's been referred to as the Donald Trump of Argentina. Very controversial character, very outspoken. And the policies that he's promoting are like no other that have been seen in Argentina. He's basically wanting to run the country on a hands-off approach, to let the market dictate what happens to Argentina. So he's intending to scrap the Argentine peso and move to the US dollar, scrap the Argentine Central Bank, and to cut spending and see what happens. And I think this is going to be a really fascinating period. Now, we've seen things like this actually being implemented before. In a number of countries around the world, such as El Salvador, they've accepted the US dollar as official currency. And things have actually gone quite well because it removes a lot of the problems that you get that build up with a black market economy. Currently, what's happening in Argentina is that people don't want to be paid in pesos because it's devaluing so rapidly. We saw from the inflation data that inflation is currently at 143%, which means that things are much, much more expensive today than they were this time last year if you're paying in pesos. And if you then look at what's been happening with the value of the peso, which has been completely tanking, if you have your life savings in pesos, they are diminishing on a daily basis. So there's been a mad scramble away from the peso towards the US dollar. Now, if you officially scrap the peso and tell everybody that they're going to be paid in US dollars and they can hold their savings in US dollars, you no longer have to worry about what's happening with the exchange rate because there isn't one, you're only dealing in US dollars. And the logic that follows on from that is that if everybody is being paid in US dollars, everything is priced in US dollars, then prices should start to stabilise. Also, from Argentina's trade point of view, they don't have to worry about foreign currency reserves when they're doing trade deals, when they're selling their grain, which is one of the biggest exports from Argentina. They'll actually be being paid in US dollars, and then they can use those dollars to buy whatever they need to buy in, such as fuel. So it removes all of those exchange rate problems. And in terms of the concept of scrapping the Argentine central bank, you saw from the data earlier that interest rates are now at 133%, and they haven't had any impact on inflation. In fact, inflation is accelerating. And the reason for that is that there's now a complete disconnect. Because all of the economy is working in US dollars, it doesn't really matter what you're doing to the official interest rate for the peso because nobody wants to deal in it. So Javier Milei's proposal to scrap the Argentine central bank probably won't have as big an impact on the economy as you would expect because the influence of the central bank has been weakened significantly. And if the economy is going to move wholesale to the dollar, they don't have to worry about the money supply in terms of producing new pesos. So in terms of the summary so far, I don't think there's any major risks associated with scrapping the peso and the Argentine central bank. But there is still a monumental task ahead for Javier Milei. The Argentine economy is currently on its knees, so taking a hands-off approach and letting the market dictate what happens isn't going to solve some of the fundamental problems. And so Javier Milei does have a massive job on his hands, and it will be really, really interesting to see what policies he does introduce, because I'm sure he will start to make some serious changes, and it will only be when we see what those policies are and then what the subsequent impact is that we'll know whether or not this is going to be a successful change of policy or if he ends up making things worse. But I think in terms of the election result, the people of Argentina have got to that stage where they've lost complete faith in the previous politicians and all of their policies, and they want something new. They want to try something radical to try to put Argentina back on the map and to get its economy back up and running. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's episode. You found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. And if you're interested in winning this statue here, then please watch the video at the end of this video after you've seen something to put a smile on your face. I'm constantly being asked about the statues in the background of my video, and I've got some really exciting news for you. I've decided to give one of these away as a prize. This guy here, who's an electroplated resin statue of a balloon dog, and if you've been watching my channel for a while, you'll know that I once posted a video about a balloon dog called Squeaky. Now this is a really fantastic piece, really reflective, quite heavy, and would make a great addition to any home. And you can win this for just £1, which is the equivalent of around $1.30, so really affordable. So rather than buying me a coffee or sending me a YouTube super thanks, why don't you buy a ticket in the raffle that I've set up to win this? Now, to keep things above board, I've got an independent company to take the cash for me and do the draw. So everything will be entirely independent. I won't be picking the winner. It will be all at random. But I will post this to anybody in the world that wins it. There is a possibility that you might need to pay a little bit of import tax, depending on where you live and what the import duties are. But this is your opportunity to win a genuine Joe Bloggs sculpture. So buy yourself a ticket and good luck in the draw.